and welcome to Lit Illuminated. I'm so excited you're here with us today. This is a space where we talk about books, not only how they help us connect to ourselves, but how they help us connect to the world around us. Today we have a special guest, Julie Salmon Kelleher, here to talk about her new book, The Sea Glass Shore, coming out in September 2026. I'm super excited to have you here, Julie. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to be here, especially with a fellow Bellinghamster. So, yeah.
Yes, I love that when I was scheduling this podcast, it was someone in my time zone.
I know.
Usually I'm trying to coordinate like Europe or East Coast or somewhere
Right,
else.
right.
So this is
The
great.
6 a.m. recording session. Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't have to like calculate time when I connected with you. So thank you for joining me here today on Lit Illuminated. And I'm super excited to talk about your new book. And part of the process of what we do on this podcast is not only like investigate the literature and what's happening in there and the methodology, but also about like the writing space and how writers work in this space. Um, I have to tell you that the first time I heard about your book, I fell in love with the concept because I love this selkie story. I think the thing is that I'm always shocked when people don't know that mythology. And I'm like, what? How can you not know that? So I'm just curious with the selkie myth, why this retelling and why now?
Yeah. First of all, I saw that you had talked a little bit about that when you talked about Blackwood's Blue Sky, which is a book that I loved too. So I was like, oh, okay, Rebecca's already going to know this one. But it is something that I think about a lot when I'm introducing the book is, do I need to explain this or not? And generally I do. So yeah, why the Selkie story and why now? I actually came across the story first when the film The Secret of Roan Inish came out, which was, of course, decades ago. And so I lived with it for a very long time. And it was always like, I love that story. I'd like to do something with it, but I wasn't quite sure what. Yeah. And I think that what appealed to me, what I was fascinated by in the story is that she always runs. So for those not familiar with the legend, Selkies are seal people and they can live in the sea as seals and they can take off their seal skins and then they look just like human beings and they can live on the land. And the Selkie story is usually a captivity narrative. Somebody finds a Selkie on the shore, steals usually her, sometimes his skin. And once the skin is stolen, they can't go back to the sea. And so then they're the person's captive. And then typically they have some kids. One of the kids finds the skin, says, hey, what's this? And like, she is out of there. She's gone. Like she is she doesn't even think. And that idea of just, there's something very appealing about that idea of just running and leaving everything behind. And I think that most people have that fantasy in some way or another. When I realized I actually wanted to write it is when I realized I'd kind of had enough with that fantasy, because most of us actually do want to live with people. And although I think many of us do have the pick up and run fantasy, we tend not to act on it, right? It's like we want to know we have the option. We don't want someone stealing our getaway or our skin. But I like living with other people. I like being a parent, like those things. And so most of us actually don't run. And I feel like in the literary tradition, and I'm a literature teacher, there are so many versions of that romantic story where the woman either runs or kills herself, and I wanted to explore, well, what would happen if this were not a captivity story? So you've still got all the things in the background. And in my story, in the background of the family, the captivity narratives are there. There's a history. Just as in my own life, there's a history of, not having legal rights for women and so forth, right? Not in my personal life, but that's the background in my society. It was actually pretty recent that somebody like me could get their own credit card, right? So there's that history, but what if you have that kind of history and you still decide that, like what would make you decide that you wanted to stay? So I was curious about that. And that's why I wrote the book.
I love that it's about not only the staying, but also the community and that kind of thinking through that. And often with the selkie story is um, it's that need to go back to home, to that place of feeling who you are. So I'm curious how you investigate any of that in the book.
Hmm. Yeah, there's this constant question of what home is for Rona, who's the selkie, and so you've got at the fundamental level, there's this sense of self that she can't function without, and that means having access to her seal skin. So if she doesn't have that, she can't be herself and she has no place and she has nothing. So there's no home there. But as she moves out of the sea and into the world, there's also she never leaves the sea behind. She's not ever moving off of the shore. She's not gonna like go live in Chicago or something, right? But her world expands. So it starts just being, in the first chapter, it's the rock she's sitting on. And she's getting to know this rock with the seaweed growing on it and what it feels like to have a body that works in gravity. And, you sit on a rock, you don't float off the rock. So it starts with that. And then the sense of home expands. So it becomes her home beach. And then she's like, well, I want to visit those docks I saw over there when I was a SEAL. Then her home becomes a house that she shares with her husband, Jack. Then she starts to become a political activist because there's a threat to her home beach. And so then she's thinking about other beaches and she's thinking about political systems. So there's this going into the world that just keeps happening, and the world gets larger and larger to her. And the longer she lives there, the more things are close to her heart and really a part of her, and they become like a home, I guess, so that it's not just the sea any longer. But I think it's key that the sea's still got to be there. She still has to have that first initial fundamental connection.
I love that. And I think it connects to my next question because for those who are listening, we are both based in Bellingham, Washington. We have the sea by us, and we have seals that we get to see all the time out there in the waters. So in reading the book, there were elements of like, oh, that sounds just like this place. So I love that you kind of pulled in where you're living into this space. I mean, I know it's fictional that you're not actually basing it in Bellingham, but I'm just curious what that process was as a writer to think about it's fictional, but you're also using some insights from where you are.
Yeah. I mean, I always wanted it to be about this place. And I remember one time early on in the process, when I was still playing around, do I write this book next or do I write this book next? I was down at the docks, and this seal popped up. It almost felt like a blessing. And so like being in this place, I was constantly getting feedback from my place, from my city, from my environment, from my home. Um, when I was drafting the book, my youngest son was still in elementary school, and I was picking him up every day. And the elementary school has this amazing view of the water. And you'll notice at the start of many of the chapters, there's just sort of a description of what does the sea look like today? And I would check every day while I was waiting for him to come out. I would take a look, and it's like, oh, what do the clouds look like? What does the sea look like? And so I was getting this constant input just from my own senses and my own sense of place. Um, so yeah, that was part of it. I knew it was going to be a fantasy story, so it didn't quite, I mean, I could have done a straight up urban fantasy where I set it in an actual location, but I decided to go with an alternate town, partly because I felt, I don't know, I just needed a little distance to tell the story. So, so it is my hometown, but it's also an alternate version. And I tried to duplicate certain things. Like the town that we live in is Bellingham, and that's a town that comes from English speaking settlers. And so I was like, okay, if I've got a town with an English resonant name, I'm going to find, another English name to go along with it in parallel, so that I was kind of creating this second version of the same place. So the town in the story is Higginson, Washington, and I named that for the Washington State's first honorary poet laureate and Bellingham resident Ella Higginson. So I was like, oh, I love the idea of having that connection to this place. So that seems like a nice parallel name. And so I did do that, when I found something that I kind of wanted to have a parallel version of the book, I'd try to provide like an analogous way to name it or think about it.
Once again, so amazing this parallel kind of life and place that you're putting in there when you also think about the parallel of seal and woman. So the imagery and sense of place that you bring into the book is so amazing. And again, because I live here too, I can sense it even more. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask a little bit about the title. So, The Sea Glass Shore, why that was the one that you ended with and you resonated with to launch the book.
The concept of the title speaks to what happens to the place in the book, which is that stories accumulate there. And there's a character early on, so when Jack, who is the person who meets and marries the selkie in the book, and he's a special collections librarian, and when he first meets her, he's not sure if he's ever going to see her again, but he's like, oh, there's this is happening in my place. There are selkies. And so he starts like kind of asking around at work, because he works in a library, and he's saying to his colleague there, are there any other, do you know any sea stories? Do you know any sort of like magical sea stories that are happening around here? He's basically like, what have I missed? Right. Um, and his colleague says, oh yeah, we've got tons of them. We've got stories like we've got sea glass. And with the image of sea glass, you throw a bottle into the bay and it doesn't go away. It just stays there, and maybe it washes up in this actually lovely form, right? So kind of the theory behind the book, and you'll see different supernatural personas appear over the course of the book. It's not just Rona, there are others too. But that anytime someone has lived on Higginson Bay and told a story there, that story is still there. Anytime an action has happened in the past, that action is still with us. So if somebody logs a hill, the hill that you live on looks different because that happened in the past. Your relationship to the land is different depending on the past and the stories that are told there. So the sea glass shore is a shore where somebody has put a story in some place, and it is coming up in a new and possibly unexpected and maybe very beautiful way, where you live. So that's the story behind the title. As far as the midlife selkie story, midlife selkie is something that my publisher came up with that I loved. And I would like to see, again, stories about midlife that are not about how you hate midlife and you want to leave. And you need to like go away and find a hotel room, or you need to hit the road, or like you need to get away from your life. I wanted a story about just the challenges of midlife and the challenges of being in a family or raising children, but also the commitment to that and the love of that. So selkie stories tend to be about the beginning or about the end. They're either about the romance at the start or the captivity at the start, right? I don't know if you want to call that a romance, or they're about what happens when the selkie gets the skin back and runs, right? And this book, most of it is kind of sitting in the middle part, where it's like, okay, this time on the land, this time in your actual life, how are you living that?
And I really do like this idea that you're talking about, the sea glass and this kind of layering, and the layering of land, the layering of stories, and how that's all connected into this as well. Which also brings me to your author's note. So I recently just was talking about author's notes and the importance of those to writers. I was talking in the space of memoir because that's typically where I see them, right? This is where they're going to like, I'm dealing with memory, and this is my interpretation of this. We don't see them a lot in fiction, but well, at least I don't. So I'm curious if like your decision to to write the author's note, and then when you're thinking of place in this, and also the story itself.
Yeah. So I knew from the start, and as I mentioned, I'd been carrying the selkie story around for decades, and I wanted to put it in the place where I lived. But a thing that happened is, so I teach at Western Washington University, and they offered this faculty continuing education, um, where we went over to the Lummi Nation and met people there and just talked. We were hosted there. And after I had been to that, I started to feel weird about just taking this Scots-Irish myth and plunking it down in basically Bellingham, Washington, or an alternative version of that, and not acknowledging that that would be a relatively new story there in the scope of history, because there were all of these native stories that had been there before. So I was like, I don't know, like, can I even write this? Like, will it work at all? And so I did some follow up visits and interviews, and I added a figure who appears on a Lummy story pole in Bellingham. Um, and I needed to have the preface there because it's really important to me that that's not my story. It's in the book indirectly. Nobody actually sees this figure or interacts with this figure. They encounter the figure the same way that I do, which is through the book that I was given, seeing the pole that is in the town. And so I felt it was really important to acknowledge at the start, this is where this story comes from. This is who it belongs to, so that there would not be any confusion as we move through the book. Yeah, just about the fact that, again, this is a story that's not mine. And a question that comes up a lot in the book is, how do you live next to a story that's not yours? You know, whether it's in Jack and Rona's personal life, that they're living with her sealskin right there in the closet. That is not Jack's story. It's not his to take. She put it there. She can take it out. Nobody else gets to, right? So how do you live next to a story that's not yours when you're living with another person? But also, how do you live next to a story that's not yours in a multicultural world?
A brief pause in programming to really offer my sincere thanks for you joining me here on the Lit Illuminated podcast, as well as all your support through likes and subscription and comments. It all matters for podcasts like this one. And I also just wanted to mention that Lit Illuminated is more than this podcast. There are other ways to get connected to literature and the way that it informs our lives. I offer workshops as well as MFA-like seminars. I do independent study as well as mentoring memoir writers. So if you're interested in getting more connected with Lit Illuminated, please check out RebeccaBeardsall.com. And thank you again for listening today. So often on this podcast, we talk about the mechanics of the book. Typically, it's me kind of going through and sharing insights that I'm seeing, but I'm curious if you can share a little bit about your writing process.
It's funny. I was talking to somebody about this recently who said, oh, so what you do is you just live with these books for years and you come back to them and then you rethink them. And I was like, oh, that makes it sound so good, because what's actually happening is I write books and they don't sell and they don't find a market. And so then a few years later, I'm like, what if I did it this way, right? The Sea Glass Shore it's my 5th book. I've written 6, and it's the first to be published. So, I do end up doing writing an initial book and then doing actually years of revisions. In this case, the biggest revision was in response to some editorial feedback that I got. I was working with an agent at the time, and I ended up, under her very good advice, cutting 40% of the book. And it was like an 8-9 month rewrite. So yeah, my process involves a lot of rewriting, a lot of time where things sit aside and then I come back. And that is not necessarily something that happens by choice. I will say I love revision. Drafted, so it's I'm not necessarily revising by choice, but it's my favorite thing to do. Drafting for me is kind of scary because it's like I'm kind of reaching out over this void and I'm not sure if there's going to be any place to land. Like, I'm not sure if it's actually going to be a book until I have a draft. And then it's like, okay, now I have a draft. But then it's usually horrible, right? And so it's like, oh, I just spent 2 years like reaching out into the void, and now here I have this pile of garbage. And so revising for me is really the fun part, because then as you revise and then you revise some more, then you start to get something that feels worth having. And I like that.
Absolutely. I think that's often, there are people out there that just like whip out a book and like it's done. But I feel like most of us, it's a process. You even mentioned like early on watching The Secret of Roan Inish and where the mythology came from. Like so much of it is something that's sitting in you for a long time, and then you're like, okay, now I'm actually going to write this, and then you're still sitting with it in the revisions and that whole process. And so much of it too is getting that connections, whether it's an editor, a beta readers, or whatever. Like you need some outside inputs as well. So yeah,
Yeah, I really couldn't do it without that. But you need outside input. You need somebody else's eyes.
yeah, exactly. Well, thanks for sharing that with us. It is always a journey, and congrats on this being the first one getting published.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, at the heart of this podcast, I talk about how story connects us in the way not only it helps us kind of understand ourselves or reflection back to us about who we are, what we value, anything in that space, but then it also in a way that it connects us to the larger world around us. So I'm just curious, in your own words, how would you see that the Sea Glass Shore connects in with that?
I think a lot of ways. First of all, in the idea that we've already talked about place and region, that's hugely important to me. I was born in Seattle and I grew up and went to college in Washington and then college in Oregon. And then I left. I went to grad school in Chicago and I ended up getting my first job out there. And so I was gone for 14 years and it was killing me. Like I wanted to come back so badly. And I had to, give up some career stuff in order to do it. So I made some sacrifices, but it was so worth it. And I'm in this place where I really feel I should be and I belong. And so I want to speak to that. And I feel like that happened again in the process of finding a publisher for the book, that I did work with an agent and the book was pitched in many places in New York City. And when that did not work out, and I ended up publishing with Forest Avenue Press, which is a Portland, Oregon press, it was like, well, of course, like, of course. And so I'm curious as to what this Northwest book from a small Northwest press, where that's going to belong in the culture. I think this is a really exciting time to think about regional books. uh, it does sometimes feel that the big publishing industry in North America is in a sort of free fall right now, and I think it's easy to catastrophize, and it's been a free fall before, and maybe things will be fine. But one of the upsides of the consolidation of the industry and what's going to happen with AI and just all of these fires happening, right, is that regional presses are thinking, well, like, hey, this is an opportunity for us. So I would like this book to be part of it. So that sort of regional commitment is part of the connections that I see the book making. As another note, again, I mentioned very few people have read the book because it's not out yet. But I've had 3 conversations already with people who are like, this hits me as a parent, that this reflects how it feels to um, to do this really, really difficult job. And those moments when people have said that have been some of the most meaningful moments to me. To have somebody say, this feels real to me, and this reflects my experience. Um, that's really important to me as a writer.
Yeah, yeah. And shout out to regional and indie presses. I'm all for them. Please support them as much as you can, everyone. Um, and your note of people haven't read it yet because it isn't out, but it is available for pre order. So please
Yes, it
be pre
is.
ordering it where you can. But I'm wishing you all those conversations, right? Those magical conversations that we have with readers as an author when they tell you how the book impacted them. And so this is also a shout out to the readers to talk to the authors, let them know. We
Yeah,
love that. We
please.
love to hear that. So please read the book, connect with Julie, let her know how much it meant to you. Also, we appreciate those reviews and those 5 stars. But is there anything else that you want to kind of share with our listeners today about your book or anything in that space? So again, this is the Sea Glass Shore.
I would just second what you said. And this is a reader's podcast, but I know you talk to writers too. And so often we really are working by ourselves on our own. And so it's such an exciting thing for me to have this book finding people. And I would love to hear from anyone who's read it and has something to say. So yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity to say that. And I hope that I do hear from some people out there.
Great. Well, thank you for joining me today. Again, reminder, The Sea Glass Shore, pre-order it today, comes out in September. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.